The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Jake's ranch, but there was no joy in its warmth. He stood on his front porch, looking out at the empty fields where his cattle used to graze. The drought had been going on for 8 months now, and it had taken everything from him. One by one, his animals had died, and with them, his dreams of keeping the family ranch alive. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead and walked toward the mailbox. These days, opening mail felt like playing Russian roulette. Every envelope could contain another bill he couldn't pay or another warning from the bank. His boots crunched on the dry grass as he made his way down the dusty path. Even the mailbox looked sad, leaning slightly to one side like everything else on his property. He pulled out a small stack of letters, mostly bills as expected. But there was something different today. A cream-colored envelope with his name written in elegant handwriting. No return address? Jake frowned and tore it open right there by the mailbox. The letter inside was unlike anything he had ever received. It was written on expensive paper, the kind that felt heavy between his fingers. The handwriting was neat and formal, like something from another century. Jake read it once, then twice, sure he was missing something. Dear Mr. Jake Thompson, it began. I am writing to you with a business proposal that may seem unusual, but I assure you it is completely serious. I am a woman of considerable means who finds herself in need of a husband for legal purposes. In return for this arrangement, I am prepared to offer you 50 head of prime cattle and enough feed to last through the winter. If this interests you, please respond to the enclosed address. Yours truly, Mrs. Victoria Hartwell. Jake looked around as if someone might be watching him, playing some kind of cruel joke. He read the letter a third time, paying attention to every word. 50 head of cattle. That was more than he had owned even before the drought. It was enough to start over, enough to save his ranch, but marriage? To a complete stranger? Jake had been married once before to his high school sweetheart Lisa. She had left him 3 years ago when the ranch started struggling. I didn't sign up for this kind of life, she had said before driving away in her packed car. Since then, Jake had focused only on trying to save his family's land. He walked back to the house, the letter clutched in his hand. Inside, he sat at his kitchen table and stared at the words again. The kitchen was small and simple, just like the rest of the house. His grandmother's old dishes still sat in the cabinet, and her recipe book lay open on the counter. This house had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built it with his own hands, and his father had worked this land until the day he died. Jake picked up his phone and called his best friend Mike, who lived in town and worked at the bank. Mike had been trying to help Jake find ways to avoid foreclosure, but they were running out of options. Mike, you're not going to believe this, Jake said when his friend answered. He read the entire letter out loud. There was silence on the other end for a long moment. Jake, buddy, that sounds like a scam. Nobody just offers 50 cattle to marry a stranger. But what if it's real? Jake asked. What if this is the answer I've been praying for? Mike sighed. Even if it's real, marriage isn't something you do for business. What do you know about this woman? She could be crazy. She could be dangerous. Jake looked around his empty house. The refrigerator hummed loudly because it was old and needed repair. The roof leaked in 2 places when it rained, which hadn't happened in months anyway. The bank notice sat on his counter, giving him 30 more days before they would take everything. I'm already in danger, Mike. I'm about to lose everything my family built. If there's even a chance this is real, I have to try. That evening, Jake sat down and wrote a response. He kept it simple and honest. He explained his situation with the ranch and said he was interested in hearing more about the arrangement. He drove to town the next morning to mail it, his hands shaking slightly as he dropped the envelope into the post office slot. For the next week, Jake tried to go about his normal routine, but his mind kept wandering to the letter. He fixed fences that protected nothing, cleaned out empty barns, and tried to plan for a future that might not exist. Every day he checked the mailbox with a mixture of hope and dread. Finally, another cream-colored envelope arrived. This one contained more details and a train ticket. Mrs. Victoria Hartwell explained that she preferred to handle the matter quickly and privately. She would arrive by train the following Friday, and if they agreed to the arrangement, they could be married that same day. She had already spoken to the local minister and arranged for the necessary paperwork. The speed of it all made Jake's head spin. Part of him wanted to throw the whole thing away and find another solution. But what other solution was there? He had tried everything. He had applied for loans, looked for work in town, even considered selling the land to developers. Nothing had worked out. Jake spent the days leading up to Friday cleaning his house and trying to imagine what this woman might be like. Was she old? Young? Why did she need to get married for legal purposes? The questions swirled in his mind, but he had no answers. He also spent time thinking about his parents and grandparents. They had worked so hard to build this ranch and keep it in the family. His father had always told him that sometimes a man had to make difficult choices to protect what mattered most. Maybe this was one of those times. On Thursday night, Jake barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his life or the smartest decision he had ever made. Either way, there was no turning back now. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. As the sun rose on Friday morning, Jake got dressed in his best clothes, the same suit he had worn to his father's funeral 2 years earlier. He looked at himself in the mirror and tried to imagine explaining this day to his children someday, if he ever had any. Would they understand why their father had made such a desperate choice? The train station was a 30-minute drive from the ranch. Jake arrived early and sat on a bench, watching for any woman traveling alone. His palms were sweaty, and his heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. This was really happening. In a few hours he might be married to a complete stranger, but his ranch might be saved. The train whistle blew in the distance, and Jake stood up, smoothing down his hair one more time. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to his old life. The drought had taken that away from him. Now all he could do was trust that sometimes the most unusual solutions were exactly what a person needed. The train pulled into the station with a loud screech of brakes, sending up a cloud of steam that made Jake squint. He stood up from the bench, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. This was it. In a few moments he would meet the woman who had sent him that mysterious letter. The woman who might save his ranch or turn his life upside down completely. Passengers began stepping off the train, and Jake watched each one carefully. An elderly man with a walking stick, a young mother carrying a crying baby, 2 businessmen in fancy suits talking loudly about some deal, but no woman traveling alone. At least none that looked like they might be Victoria Hartwell. Then he saw her, and his breath caught in his throat. She was walking slowly down the platform, flanked by 2 serious-looking people. A man and a woman, both dressed in dark clothing, and carrying themselves like bodyguards or lawyers. Between them walked a figure completely covered by a heavy black veil that hung down past her shoulders. Even her hands were covered by long black gloves. Jake could see nothing of her face or figure beneath the flowing dark dress and veil. The trio approached him, and the man spoke first. "Mr. Thompson?" "I am Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Hartwell's representative. This is Miss Green, her companion." Jake nodded, not sure what to say. He had expected to meet Victoria face to face, to talk and get to know each other a little before making such a big decision. Instead, he was looking at someone who seemed more like a ghost than a potential wife. "Mrs. Hartwell prefers to keep things formal until after the ceremony," Mr. Blackwood explained, as if reading Jake's thoughts. "She hopes you understand. This arrangement is quite important to her, and she values her privacy." The veiled woman stepped forward slightly and spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft but clear, with a slight accent Jake couldn't quite place. "Mr. Thompson, I want to thank you for agreeing to this arrangement. I know it must seem very strange to you." "It is strange," Jake admitted, trying to see even a hint of her face through the veil. "But I appreciate the opportunity. I really need those cattle you mentioned." "Of course," she said. "Business first." "That's how it should be." Mr. Blackwood pulled out a thick envelope. "The cattle are already on their way to your ranch. They should arrive tomorrow morning, along with enough feed and supplies to last through the winter. Mrs. Hartwell keeps her promises." Jake felt a surge of relief mixed with disbelief. The cattle were real. This wasn't some elaborate scam after all. But looking at the mysterious woman before him, he felt more confused than ever. Why all the secrecy? Why the veil? And why did she need to get married so urgently? "The minister is waiting for us at the church," Miss Green said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was cold and businesslike. "We should proceed immediately." The walk to the church took only 10 minutes, but it felt like the longest walk of Jake's life. People on the street stopped and stared at their unusual group. A man in work clothes walking beside 3 people dressed like they were going to a funeral. Some folks whispered to each other behind their hands. Jake recognized several faces from town. People who would certainly be talking about this for weeks to come. Mrs. Patterson from the general store nearly dropped her shopping bag when she saw them pass. Old Henry from the gas station stood with his mouth hanging open. Jake tried to tip his hat and act normal, but nothing about this situation was normal. The church was small and simple, the same place where Jake had been baptized as a child and where his parents had been married 30 years earlier. Minister Williams was waiting for them at the altar, looking just as confused as everyone else. He had known Jake his whole life and had clearly not expected anything like this. "Jake," the minister said quietly when they reached the front. "Are you sure about this, son?" Jake looked at the veiled woman beside him. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her. He still couldn't see her face, couldn't tell if she was young or old, happy or sad. For all he knew, she could be anyone under that veil. "I'm sure," Jake said, though his voice came out more like a croak. The ceremony itself was the strangest thing Jake had ever experienced. Minister Williams read through the traditional vows, but everything felt like a dream. When it came time for the bride to speak, Victoria's voice was steady and clear, but she sounded like she was reading from a script. There was no emotion, no joy, no nervousness. Just words. Jake found himself stuttering through his own vows, distracted by trying to catch any glimpse of the woman he was marrying. Once, when she turned her head slightly, he thought he saw the outline of her profile through the veil, but it was too dark to make out any details. When Minister Williams asked if anyone objected to the marriage, the church fell completely silent. Jake half expected someone to stand up and declare this whole thing crazy, but no one said a word. The few townspeople who had followed them into the church just sat there with wide eyes, watching like they were seeing a magic show. "You may kiss the bride," Minister Williams finally said, but his voice was uncertain. Victoria stepped back slightly and shook her head. "That won't be necessary," she said quietly. "This is a business arrangement, after all." Jake felt his face turn red. The minister looked embarrassed. The people in the church began whispering among themselves. But Mr. Blackwood just nodded as if this was perfectly normal. After they signed the marriage certificate, Mr. Blackwood handed Jake another envelope. "The deed transfers for the cattle and some additional paperwork you'll need. Everything is legal and proper." Outside the church, 3 large wagons were waiting, loaded with trunks and boxes. Jake stared at them in amazement. How much stuff did one person need? And what was in all those containers? "Mrs. Hartwell's belongings, Miss Green explained. She need them at the ranch." The ride back to Jake's property was quiet and awkward. Victoria sat across from him in the wagon, still completely veiled, saying nothing. Mr. Blackwood and Miss Green followed in a second wagon with all the luggage. Jake tried several times to start a conversation, but Victoria only gave short, polite answers. When they finally reached the ranch, Jake felt a shock of surprise. In the distance, he could see cattle grazing in his fields. Beautiful, healthy animals, more than he had seen on his land in years. It was like a miracle. "The cattle," he breathed. "As promised," Victoria said. "I hope they meet your expectations." As the sun began to set, Mr. Blackwood and Miss Green unloaded Victoria's belongings and carried them into the house. Jake watched in amazement as trunk after trunk disappeared into his small home. Finally, the 2 companions said their goodbyes and left in their wagon. Heading back toward town, Jake stood on his porch next to his new wife, still not believing any of this was real. The cattle lowed softly in the distance. His ranch was saved. But as he looked at the mysterious woman beside him, still hidden beneath her veil, he realized his real adventure was just beginning. "Well, Mrs. Thompson," he said, testing out the sound of her new name, "welcome home." Victoria turned toward him, and for just a moment Jake thought he saw her nod slightly beneath the veil. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I think this arrangement will work out well for both of us." The house felt different with Victoria inside it. Jake stood in his living room, watching as his new wife looked around the small space. She still wore that heavy veil, and he was starting to wonder if she planned to keep it on forever. The silence between them was thick and uncomfortable, like the air before a thunderstorm. "It's not much," Jake said, gesturing around the modest room, "but it's clean and sturdy. My grandfather built this place with his own hands." Victoria nodded slowly. "It's perfectly fine, Mr. Thompson. I'm not here for luxury." Jake winced at the formal way she said his name. They were married now, but she spoke to him like he was a stranger she had just met at the bank. Which, he supposed, wasn't far from the truth. "You can call me Jake," he offered. "And should I call you Victoria? Or do you prefer Mrs. Thompson?" "Now?" She was quiet for a moment, standing very still in the middle of his living room. "Victoria will be fine." Jake showed her around the small house, feeling more awkward with each room. The kitchen where his grandmother had cooked thousands of meals. The sitting room where his family had gathered every evening. His parents' old bedroom, which he had been using since they passed away. And finally, the spare room that had once been his childhood bedroom. "You can stay in here," Jake said, opening the door to the spare room. "I'll move some of my mother's old things out to make space for your belongings." Victoria stepped into the room and looked around. It was small, but comfortable, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the fields. "This will do perfectly," she said. Jake waited for her to say something else. Maybe ask about the sleeping arrangements or explain why she needed to keep the veil on. But she just stood there, her hands folded in front of her, waiting for him to leave. "Well," Jake said finally, "I guess I'll let you get settled. Dinner will be ready in about an hour, if you're hungry." "That's very kind, but I brought my own food," Victoria replied. "I have specific dietary needs." Jake frowned. "What kind of dietary needs?" "Nothing serious. Just particular about what I eat," another mysterious answer. Jake was starting to realize that his new wife spoke in riddles, never giving him a straight answer about anything. But he was tired from the strange day, and he decided not to push it. He left her alone and went to the kitchen to heat up some leftover stew. While he ate his simple dinner, he could hear Victoria moving around in the spare room, unpacking her many trunks. There were soft sounds of things being moved and arranged, but she was clearly trying to be quiet about it. After dinner, Jake sat in his living room reading an old farming magazine, but he couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes he would hear a sound from Victoria's room. A soft thud, the creak of the floorboards. Once, he could have sworn he heard what sounded like tools clinking together, but that didn't make any sense. As the evening wore on, Jake found himself getting nervous about bedtime. What was the proper way to handle the first night of a marriage that wasn't really a marriage? Should he say goodnight? Should he check if she needed anything? They were strangers living in the same house, and he had no idea what the rules were. Supposed to be around 9 o'clock, Victoria emerged from her room. She had changed out of her heavy black dress and into a simple dark robe, but she still wore the veil. Jake could see that she was a large woman, much heavier than he had expected, but the veil still hid her face completely. "Mr. Thompson," she said formally, "I wanted to discuss our living arrangements." "Of course," Jake said, setting down his magazine. "What did you want to discuss?" Victoria sat down in the chair across from him, careful to keep her distance. "I want to make sure we understand each other clearly. This marriage is a business transaction, nothing more. I needed a husband for legal reasons, and you needed financial help. That's where our relationship begins and ends." Jake nodded slowly. "I understand that. But we're going to be living in the same house. We should probably try to be friendly, at least." "Friendly is acceptable," Victoria agreed. "But I want you to understand that there will be no romantic expectations. We will Live as roommates, not as husband and wife. That's fine with me, Jake said, though he felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. What about meals? Chores around the house? I'll take care of my own needs, Victoria said. I don't want to be a burden, and I prefer my privacy. Jake was quiet for a moment, studying the mysterious woman across from him. Can I ask you something? Victoria tensed slightly. What is it? Why do you need to stay married? What kind of legal reasons? Victoria was silent for so long that Jake thought she might not answer at all. Finally, she spoke in a voice so quiet. He had to lean forward to hear her. There are people who want to take something that belongs to me. Being married makes it harder for them to do that. What kind of people? Bad people, Victoria said, and her voice carried a note of fear that made Jake sit up straighter. People who don't care about right and wrong. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Are you in danger? Not as long as I stay hidden, Victoria said. That's why I need this arrangement. That's why I need to keep my privacy. Now Jake understood. A little better. Victoria wasn't just eccentric or shy. She was hiding from something or someone. That explained the veil, the formal behavior, and the strange urgency of their marriage. Well, Jake said carefully, you're safe here. This ranch is pretty isolated and I don't get many visitors. Thank you, Victoria said, and for the first time, her voice sounded genuinely grateful. That means a great deal to me. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Jake found himself wanting to ask more questions, but he could tell that Victoria had already shared more than she was comfortable with. I think I'll turn in for the night, Victoria said finally, standing up from her chair. Good night, Victoria, Jake said. Sleep well. Victoria walked toward her room, but paused at the doorway. Good night, Jake, she said softly. It was the first time she had used his first name, and it made him smile. Jake stayed up for another hour, thinking about everything that had happened. His life had completely changed in a single day. He was married to a mysterious woman who was hiding from dangerous people. His ranch was saved by 50 head of cattle that had appeared like magic, and he was living with someone who might as well be a ghost. When he finally went to his own bedroom, he could see light coming from under Victoria's door. She was still awake, moving around quietly. Jake changed into his nightclothes and lay down in his bed. Staring at the ceiling, around midnight, he heard Victoria's door open and close softly. Then he heard what sounded like the click of a lock. Jake frowned and got up quietly, walking to his bedroom door. He opened it carefully and peered down the hallway. Victoria's door was definitely closed, and when he walked closer, he could see that there was no light coming from under it anymore. He reached for the door handle, not planning to go in, but just curious if it would turn. It didn't. The door was locked from the inside. Jake stood there for a moment, confused. His house didn't have locks on the bedroom doors. His family had never needed them. But somehow, Victoria had managed to lock herself in. The next morning, Jake woke up early as usual and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Victoria's door was still closed, and he couldn't hear any movement from inside. He wondered if she was still sleeping or if she was awake and just being very quiet. He made extra coffee and knocked gently on her door. Victoria? I made coffee if you'd like some. Thank you, but I'm fine, came the muffled reply from inside. Jake waited, hoping she might open the door or say something else. But there was only silence. As he stood there in the hallway, holding 2 cups of coffee, Jake realized that his new life was going to be full of mysteries. His wife was a puzzle he might never solve, living behind a locked door in his own house. But the cattle were real, his ranch was saved, and somehow, despite all the strangeness, he didn't feel alone anymore. Even if Victoria was a mystery, she was his mystery now. And Jake had always been good at solving problems, even when they seemed impossible. Jake woke up before dawn the next morning, as he had every day for the past 20 years. The rooster hadn't even started crowing yet, but his body was used to the early hours. He pulled on his work clothes and stepped out of his bedroom, expecting to find the house quiet and still. Instead, he heard soft sounds coming from the kitchen. Someone was already awake and moving around. Jake crept quietly down the hallway, not wanting to startle Victoria if she was up early too. But when he peeked around the corner into the kitchen, he got a shock. Victoria was standing at his stove, cooking what smelled like the most delicious breakfast he had ever smelled. She was still wearing her veil, but she had put on a simple apron over her dark dress. Steam rose from several pans, and the whole kitchen was filled with amazing smells. "Good morning," Victoria said without turning around. Somehow, she had heard him coming even though he thought he was being quiet. "Morning," Jake replied, still surprised. "You're up early." "I've always been an early riser," Victoria said, stirring something in a large pan. "I hope you don't mind me using your kitchen. I wanted to make breakfast." "Of course I don't mind," Jake said, though he was confused. The night before, Victoria had said she brought her own food and had special dietary needs. Now she was cooking. Enough food for a small army. "Sit down," Victoria said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Breakfast is almost ready." Jake sat down and watched as Victoria moved around his kitchen like she had been cooking there for years. She knew exactly where everything was, even though she had only been in the house for one night. When she served the food, Jake's eyes went wide, fluffy pancakes, perfectly cooked eggs, crispy bacon, and fresh biscuits that were still warm from the oven. There was also some kind of fruit jam that looked homemade and coffee that smelled better than anything he had ever made. "This is incredible," Jake said after taking his first bite. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Victoria sat down across from him, but she didn't remove her veil to eat. Instead, she carefully lifted the bottom edge just enough to take small bites, keeping her face hidden. "I've had a lot of practice over the years." Jake wanted to ask more questions, but Victoria seemed uncomfortable talking about herself. Instead, he just enjoyed the best breakfast he had eaten in years. When they were finished, Victoria began cleaning the dishes before Jake could even offer to help. "You don't need to do that," Jake said. "I can clean up." "I don't mind," Victoria replied. "I like to keep busy." After breakfast, Jake went outside to check on his new cattle. They were beautiful animals, healthy and well-fed, grazing peacefully in his fields. As he walked among them, he noticed something strange. These weren't just any cattle. They were expensive, high-quality breeds that most ranchers could only dream of owning. He was so focused on examining the animals that he didn't notice. Victoria had come outside until she spoke from right behind him. "The Black Angus are particularly good for this climate," she said. "And that group over there, the Herefords, they'll give you excellent calves next spring." Jake turned around in surprise. Victoria was standing a few feet away, still veiled, but she was looking at his cattle with obvious knowledge and interest. "You know about cattle?" Jake asked. "A little," Victoria said modestly. But as they walked through the field together, it became clear that she knew a lot more than a little. She pointed out things about the animals that Jake hadn't even noticed. Which ones were the best breeding stock, which pastures would be best for different times of year, and how to arrange the feeding schedule for maximum efficiency. "That fence line over there," Victoria said, pointing toward the eastern edge of the property. "You'll want to reinforce it before winter. The posts are starting to lean, and if you get heavy snow, the whole thing could come down." Jake looked where she was pointing and realized she was absolutely right. He had been so worried about keeping his existing cattle alive that he hadn't noticed the fence was failing. "How did you see that from here?" Jake asked. "I've walked this property 100 times and missed it." "I noticed things," Victoria said simply. Over the next few days, Jake began to realize that Victoria noticed everything. She had suggestions for improving his irrigation system, ideas for better crop rotation, and solutions to problems he didn't even know he had. It was like having a farming expert living in his house, except this expert kept herself hidden behind a veil and locked her door every night. Jake also started noticing Victoria's strange schedule. She was always up before him in the morning, and she often disappeared for hours during the day. Sometimes he would see her walking toward the old barn on the far side of his property, carrying packages or bundles he couldn't identify. When he asked about it, she just said she was taking care of personal business. One afternoon, Jake decided to follow her. He felt bad about spying, but his curiosity was getting the better of him. He watched from a distance as Victoria entered the old barn and stayed inside for over an hour. When she finally came out, she looked around carefully before walking back toward the house. That evening, Jake found an excuse to go to the barn. Inside, he found that Victoria had cleaned out a section and set up what looked like a small workshop. There were tools he didn't recognize, several large mirrors, and boxes of supplies that she must have brought in her trunks. But everything was arranged neatly and covered with sheets, so he couldn't tell what it was all for. Jake also noticed that Victoria received packages almost every day. The delivery truck would come up the long driveway, and Victoria would meet. The driver outside, always wearing her veil. She would sign for packages and carry them quickly into the house or out to the barn. When Jake asked about the deliveries, Victoria just said they were personal supplies. The packages came from all over the country. Medical supply companies, specialty food distributors, and businesses Jake had never heard of. One day, he noticed a return address from a company in New York that seemed to deal with theatrical supplies. Another package came from a place that sold wigs and cosmetics. Jake couldn't figure out what Victoria could possibly need with any of those things, but the strangest thing was how Victoria seemed to know so much about his business. One morning, she mentioned that the feed prices in town had gone up 20% in the past month. Jake hadn't heard about that, but when he called his supplier, it turned out to be true. Another time, she warned him that the weather forecast showed a cold snap coming that could be dangerous for newborn calves. Again, she was right. How do you know all this stuff? Jake asked one evening as they sat in the living room. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. I keep track of things that matter, she said finally. But how? You never leave the ranch and you don't seem to read the newspaper or listen to the radio. I have my ways, Victoria said, and Jake could hear a small smile in her voice. Jake was starting to realize that his mysterious wife was full of surprises. She could cook like a professional chef. She knew more about ranching than most people who had been doing it their whole lives. And she seemed to have access to information that he couldn't figure out how she was getting, but Victoria also had habits that seemed almost secretive. She never ate meals at the same time as Jake, always finding excuses to eat alone. She kept her bedroom door locked all the time, even during the day when she wasn't in there. And Jake was pretty sure she was doing something in that barn workshop, but he couldn't figure out what. One evening, Jake was walking past Victoria's bedroom when he heard a sound that stopped him in his tracks. It sounded like sobbing, soft and heartbroken. He stood outside the door for several minutes, listening to his wife cry and feeling helpless. He wanted to knock and ask if she was okay, but something told him that Victoria wouldn't appreciate the intrusion. Instead, he went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea, the kind his mother used to make when someone in the family was upset. He left it outside Victoria's door with a quiet knock and a whispered, "I made you some tea." The crying stopped immediately, and after a few minutes, Jake heard the door open briefly. When he checked later, the cup was gone. The next morning, Victoria seemed normal again, cooking breakfast and talking about the cattle as if nothing had happened. But Jake couldn't forget the sound of her crying. Whatever Victoria was hiding from, whatever had brought her to his ranch, it was causing her real pain. Jake found himself wanting to help her, but he didn't know how. Victoria had built walls around herself that seemed impossible to climb. All he could do was try to make her feel safe and hope that someday she would trust him enough to let him in. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria arrived at the ranch, and Jake was starting to feel like he was living with a friendly ghost. She was always there, helping with everything from cooking to cattle management, but she remained completely hidden. Behind that mysterious veil, Jake had begun to accept that this was just how their strange marriage would work, but then he started noticing small changes that made him question everything he thought he knew about his wife. It began one morning, when Jake was fixing a broken fence post near the barn. He looked up and saw Victoria walking across the yard, carrying a bucket of feed for the chickens. Something about the way she moved caught his attention. Her steps seemed lighter somehow, more confident. The heavy, careful way she had walked when she first arrived was gone, replaced by something that almost looked like grace. Jake shook his head, thinking he was imagining things. After all, people could change how they walked when they got more comfortable in a new place. But over the next few days, he kept noticing the same thing. Victoria moved differently now, like she weighed less or felt more free. One afternoon, Jake was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when Victoria walked past the window outside. He glanced up casually, then did a double take. From the side, through the glass, Victoria looked different, smaller somehow. The loose dark dresses she always wore seemed to hang on her differently than they had when she first arrived. That's impossible, Jake muttered to himself. People didn't just shrink in 3 weeks, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing about Victoria's appearance. Jake started paying closer attention, trying to be subtle about it. When Victoria reached up to get something from a high shelf, her movement seemed easier and more fluid. When she bent down to pet one of the barn cats, she moved like someone who was comfortable in their own body, not like the awkward, heavy person who had stepped off the train. The more Jake watched, the more convinced he became that Victoria was somehow getting smaller. But that didn't make any sense. People didn't lose significant weight in just a few weeks, especially not people who cooked and ate the way Victoria did, or did they eat the way Jake thought they did? Jake realized he had never actually seen Victoria eat a full meal. She cooked elaborate breakfasts and dinners, but she always ate alone in her room or found excuses to skip meals entirely. When she did eat in front of him, she only took a few small bites before saying she was full. One evening, Jake decided to test his theory. Victoria had made a delicious pot roast with vegetables, enough food for 4 people. She served Jake a heaping plate, then made herself a much smaller portion. "Aren't you hungry?" Jake asked. "You've been working hard all day." "I ate earlier," Victoria replied, settling into her chair with her small plate, but Jake was watching carefully now. Victoria took tiny bites, chewing slowly and carefully. She spent most of the meal pushing food around on her plate rather than actually eating it. When she finished, more than half of her food was still there. "You barely touched your dinner," Jake observed. Victoria paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "I told you I have specific dietary needs." "What kind of dietary needs?" Jake pressed. Gently. "Maybe I could help with the cooking if I understood better." Victoria set down her fork and was quiet for a long moment. "I'm trying to be healthier," she said finally. "I need to lose some weight for medical reasons." That explanation made sense, but it didn't explain everything Jake was noticing. Even if Victoria was on a strict diet, the changes he was seeing seemed too dramatic for such a short time period. A few days later, Jake got another clue about what might be happening. He was walking past the barn when he heard Victoria talking to someone inside. He could hear her voice clearly, but he couldn't hear anyone responding. Jake crept closer to the barn and listened. "I know it's risky," Victoria was saying, "but I can't keep this up much longer. It's getting harder to hide." Jake frowned. Who was she talking to? He hadn't seen anyone else on the property, and there were no cars or horses around except his own truck. "The padding is starting to shift," Victoria continued, "and these clothes are getting too big." He's going to notice soon. Padding? Jake's mind raced. What kind of padding would Victoria be talking about? And why would her clothes be getting too big? "I need to be more careful," Victoria said. "Maybe I should order some smaller sizes, make the transition more gradual." Jake backed away from the barn, his head spinning with questions. It sounded like Victoria was wearing some kind of padding under her clothes to make herself look bigger than she really was. But why would anyone do that, and who was she talking to about it? That night, Jake lay in bed thinking about everything. He had observed the way Victoria moved differently now, how she barely ate despite cooking elaborate meals, the mysterious packages that arrived regularly, the workshop she had set up in the barn. And now this conversation about padding and clothes that were too big. A crazy idea began forming in Jake's mind. What if Victoria wasn't who she appeared to be at all? What if the heavy, awkward woman who had stepped off the train was some kind of disguise? The next morning, Jake decided to pay more attention to Victoria's daily routine. He watched as she left the house after breakfast and headed toward the barn with a small bag. She stayed inside for about an hour, then came back to the house. When she returned, Jake could swear she looked different again. Not dramatically different, but enough to make him question what he was seeing. Later that day, Jake found an excuse to go into the barn while Victoria was in the house. He looked around her workshop area more carefully this time. Most of the equipment was still covered with sheets, but he could see the edges of things that looked like sewing supplies, mirrors, and what might have been makeup containers. In one corner, Jake spotted something that made his heart race. Sticking out from under a canvas tarp was what looked like fabric padding, the kind that might be sewn into clothing to change someone's shape. There were also what looked like wigs or hair pieces, though he couldn't see them clearly enough to be sure. Jake backed out of the barn quickly, not wanting to be caught snooping, but his mind was reeling with possibilities. Was Victoria wearing a disguise? Had she been disguising herself this whole time? That evening, Jake watched Victoria more carefully than ever. She was preparing dinner, moving around the kitchen with that newfound grace he had been noticing. When she reached up to get a spice from the top shelf, Jake could see that her arm looked thinner than it had before. When she bent down to check something in the oven, her movements were smooth and easy. "Victoria," Jake said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" She turned around, and even though he couldn't see her face through the veil, Jake sensed that she was nervous. "What is it?" she asked. "Are you feeling all right? You seem lately?" Victoria was quiet for several seconds. "Different how?" Jake chose his words carefully. "You seem more comfortable here, more at ease, and maybe lighter somehow." Victoria turned back to the stove quickly. "I told you I'm trying to be healthier. All the fresh air and work around the ranch is good for me." But Jake could hear tension in her voice now. Whatever secret Victoria was keeping, his questions were making her uncomfortable. That night, Jake heard Victoria moving around in her room more than usual. There were soft sounds of things being moved or rearranged. At one point, he could have sworn he heard the sound of scissors cutting through fabric. Jake lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together the puzzle of his mysterious wife. Everything he had observed pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Victoria was somehow transforming herself, becoming a different person than the one who had arrived at his ranch. But why? Who was she really? And what was she so afraid of that she needed to hide behind such an elaborate disguise? Jake realized that living with Victoria was like watching a magic trick in slow motion. Something incredible was happening right in front of his eyes, but he couldn't figure out how it was being done. All he knew was that the woman sleeping in the room next to his was not who she appeared to be. And despite all the mystery and confusion, Jake found himself more curious about his wife than ever before. Jake was feeding the cattle early one morning when he saw a car coming up his long driveway. It was unusual for anyone to visit the ranch, especially this early in the day. As the car got closer, Jake could see it was a black sedan with two people inside. Something about the way they drove, slow and careful, like they were looking for something, made Jake feel uneasy. The car stopped near the house and two people got out. A man and a woman, both dressed in dark business clothes. They looked serious and official, like police officers or lawyers. Jake walked toward them, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Can I help you folks?" Jake called out. The man stepped forward and pulled out a badge. "I'm Detective Reynolds, and this is Detective Martinez. We're looking for a woman named Victoria Hartwell. We have reason to believe she might be in this area." Jake felt his stomach drop. These people were looking for his wife, but they were calling her by a different name than the one she had given him. He tried to keep his expression neutral. "I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone by that name," Jake said carefully. Detective Martinez stepped forward, holding up a photograph. "Are you sure? This woman has been missing for several months. Her family is very worried about her." Jake looked at the photograph and felt confused. It showed a young woman with long blonde hair and a bright smile. She was beautiful and looked nothing like the heavy, veiled woman living in his house. But there was something about the eyes in the photo that seemed familiar. "I've never seen this person before," Jake said honestly. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it?" Detective Reynolds asked. Jake nodded. We understand you recently got married. Could we perhaps speak with your wife? Jake's mind raced. He couldn't let these detectives talk to Victoria without warning her first. Something was clearly going on that he didn't understand, but he felt protective of the woman who had saved his ranch. She's not feeling well today, Jake said. Maybe you could come back another time? The detectives exchanged a look. Mr. Thompson, this is a serious matter. Victoria Hartwell is a wealthy young woman who disappeared after receiving threats. Her family hired us to find her because they're concerned for her safety. I told you I don't know anyone by that name, Jake repeated. Detective Martinez pulled out a business card. If you see this woman or hear anything about her, please call us immediately. It's very important that we find her. After the detectives left, Jake stood in his yard for a long time, staring at the photograph they had shown him. The woman in the picture looked nothing like Victoria, but those eyes, there was something about those eyes that made him think of his wife. Jake walked quickly to the house and knocked on Victoria's bedroom door. Victoria, we need to talk. It's important. There was a long pause before Victoria answered. What is it, Jake? Some detectives were just here. They were looking for someone named Victoria Hartwell. They said she's been missing for months. Jake heard a sharp intake of breath from inside the room. Then there was silence for almost a full minute. Victoria? Jake called softly. Are you okay? Give me a few minutes, Victoria said, and her voice sounded shaky. Then meet me in the barn. Jake waited by the barn for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. When Victoria finally appeared, she looked different. She was walking differently, moving with quick, nervous steps instead of her usual careful pace. She was still wearing the veil, but even that seemed to sit differently on her head. Jake, Victoria said as she approached him, I need to tell you the truth about who I am. Okay, Jake said gently. I'm listening. Victoria took a deep breath. My real name isn't Victoria Hartwell. It's not Victoria Thompson either. My name is Catherine Wells, and everything I told you about needing to get married for legal reasons was only half true. Jake felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. What do you mean? I'm hiding from dangerous people, but they're not trying to steal my inheritance. They're trying to hurt me because I witnessed something I shouldn't have seen. Catherine's voice was getting stronger as she talked, like telling the truth was giving her courage. 6 months ago, I was working as an accountant for a company in the city. I discovered that my boss was stealing money from his clients, millions of dollars. What happened? Jake asked. I tried to report it to the authorities, but my boss found out before I could get the evidence to the police. He threatened me, said he would make sure I disappeared if I didn't keep quiet. That night, someone broke into my apartment and trashed everything. They left a note saying next time they wouldn't just destroy my things. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. So you ran away? I had to, Catherine said. But I knew they would be looking for me everywhere. I had to become someone else completely, someone they would never think to look for. The Victoria Hartwell identity? Catherine nodded. Victoria Hartwell was a real person, but she died in a car accident 2 years ago. She was a wealthy widow with no family, and her death wasn't well publicized. I borrowed her identity. Jake was quiet for a moment, trying to process everything Catherine was telling him. And the way you look? The weight, the veil? Catherine was silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was very quiet. That's not who I really am either. Jake felt his heart racing. What do you mean? Jake, I need you to promise me something before I show you the truth. What is it? Promise me you won't be angry. Promise me you'll understand that everything I did was because I was scared and desperate. Jake looked at the veiled figure in front of him, thinking about all the kindness she had shown him, all the ways she had helped save his ranch and make his life better. I promise, he said. Catherine reached up with shaking hands and slowly pulled off the heavy veil. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The woman standing in front of him was not the heavy, mysterious figure he had been living with. She was the woman from the photograph the detectives had shown him. Beautiful, young, with long blonde hair that had been hidden under the veil. She was thin and graceful, nothing like the bulky appearance she had maintained since arriving at the ranch. "You're her?" Jake said softly. "You're Victoria Hartwell." "I mean, you're Catherine, but you look like the woman in the photo," Catherine nodded, tears in her eyes. "I've been wearing padding and special clothing to change my appearance. I've been hiding my real face under veils and makeup. I've been pretending to be someone completely different because I was terrified that if anyone saw the real me, those dangerous people would find me." Jake stared at her, trying to reconcile this beautiful young woman with the mysterious figure he had married. "Why did you trust me enough to tell me the truth?" "Because you've been kind to me," Catherine said. "Because you gave me a safe place to hide when I had nowhere else to go. And because those detectives being here means my hiding time might be running out." Jake felt overwhelmed by everything he had learned. His wife wasn't who he thought she was, but she also wasn't a stranger trying to trick him. She was a brave woman who had risked everything to do the right thing and was now paying the price for her courage. "What happens now?" Jake asked. "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "Those detectives might come back. The people I'm hiding from might find me here. I might have put you in danger just by staying." Jake looked at Catherine's worried face, and despite all the lies and deception, he felt something he hadn't expected. He felt protective of her. This brave, scared woman had trusted him with her life and wasn't going to let her down. "We'll figure it out," Jake said firmly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Jake, you don't understand what you're saying. These people are really dangerous." "Then we'd better make sure we're ready for them," Jake said. 2 days after Catherine revealed her true identity, Jake was fixing a broken water pump when he saw dust clouds on the horizon. 3 black cars were speeding toward his ranch, moving much faster than the detectives had driven. Something about the way they approached made Jake's stomach clench with fear. "Catherine!" Jake shouted toward the house. "Get inside and lock the doors." Jake grabbed his rifle from the barn and positioned himself behind his truck. He had never been in a real fight before, but he wasn't going to let anyone hurt Catherine without a struggle. The cars roared up his driveway and stopped in a semicircle around his house, blocking any escape routes. 5 men got out of the cars. They were all wearing expensive suits, but they moved like soldiers or criminals. The man in the front was tall and thin with cold gray eyes. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made Jake think of wolves looking at sheep. "Mr. Thompson," the man called out. "My name is Richard Davidson. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jake kept his rifle ready but pointed down. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Davidson said, walking closer. "You see, a few months ago, one of my employees stole some very important documents from my office. She also took something much more valuable information that could ruin my business and send me to prison." "I told you I don't know what you're talking about," Jake repeated. Davidson's smile got wider and more dangerous. "The woman is here, Mr. Thompson. We know she is. We've been tracking her for months, and this little ranch is the end of the road?" One of Davidson's men whispered something in his ear. Davidson nodded and looked back at Jake. "You married her, didn't you?" Davidson said. "Poor farmer? Desperate for money? Agrees to marry a mysterious woman for some cattle?" "Very touching story. But I'm afraid your wife has been lying to you about who she really is." Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. "My wife and I don't have any secrets. Is that so?" Davidson pulled out a tablet and showed Jake a photograph. It was Catherine, but not the disguised version Jake had been living with. It was Catherine as she really looked beautiful and young, standing outside an office building in the city. "This is Catherine Wells. She worked for me until she decided to steal from me and run away." "Even if that's true," Jake said carefully, "that doesn't give you the right to come onto my property with guns." Davidson looked around at his men, who Jake now noticed were all carrying weapons under their jackets. "Mr. Thompson, you seem like a reasonable man. All I want is my employee back, and the documents she stole. Give me those 2 things and we'll leave you alone. Your cattle, your ranch, your life, you can keep all of it. And if I don't? Davidson's smile disappeared completely. Then we'll take what we came for anyway, and you'll wish you had cooperated. At that moment, the front door of Jake's house opened. Catherine stepped out, but she wasn't wearing her disguise anymore. She looked exactly like the woman in Davidson's photograph, young, beautiful, and terrified, but trying to be brave. Let him alone, Richard, Catherine called out. This is between you and me. Davidson's eyes lit up when he saw her. There she is. Catherine Wells, the little accountant who thought she could outsmart me. Catherine walked slowly toward the group of men, her hands visible and empty. I'll come with you, but only if you promise to leave Jake out of this. He doesn't know anything about the documents or the money you stole. Catherine, no. Jake stepped forward, but one of Davidson's men pulled out a gun and pointed it at him. Stay where you are, farmer, the man said. Davidson studied Catherine like she was an interesting puzzle. You know, Catherine, you've caused me a lot of trouble. Do you have any idea how much money I've spent looking for you? I know exactly how much, Catherine said. Because I know how much you stole from your clients. $12 million, Richard. $12 million that belonged to people who trusted you with their life savings. Davidson's face darkened. That money was payment for services rendered? My clients got exactly what they paid for. Your clients got lies and fake investment reports while you moved their money to offshore accounts, Catherine shot back. I saw the real books, Richard. I know what you did. Jake watched this exchange. With growing understanding, Catherine hadn't just witnessed a crime. She had evidence of it. That's why Davidson was so desperate to find her. Where are the documents, Catherine? Davidson asked. The real accounting records, the bank transfer information, all of it? Where? Did you hide it? Catherine lifted her chin defiantly. Somewhere safe? Somewhere you'll never find it. Davidson nodded to one of his men who grabbed Catherine's arm roughly. She winced but didn't cry out. Maybe you'll feel more cooperative after. We have a little chat in private, Davidson said. That's when Jake made his decision. He couldn't let them take Catherine. He had promised to protect her, and he meant it, even if it cost him everything. Let her go, Jake said, raising his rifle. Davidson laughed. Mr. Thompson, you're outnumbered 5-1. Are you really going to start a gunfight over a woman you barely know? I know enough, Jake said. I know she's brave enough to risk her life to do the right thing. I know she's been nothing but kind to me. And I know I'm not going to let you hurt her. For a moment, nobody moved. Jake could hear his heart beating in his ears. Davidson's men had their hands on their weapons, ready to draw. Catherine was looking at Jake with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Then Jake heard the sound of car engines in the distance. More vehicles were approaching the ranch. But these sounded different. Official Davidson heard them too, and his confident expression started to crack. What did you do? He demanded, looking at Catherine. I didn't do anything, Catherine said. But Jake could see hope starting to bloom in her eyes. The new vehicles came into view, 2 police cars and an unmarked sedan. They pulled up behind Davidson's cars, effectively trapping his men on the ranch. Officers got out quickly, weapons drawn. This is Sheriff Morrison, came a voice through a loudspeaker. Everyone put your weapons down and put your hands where we can see them. Davidson's men looked confused and scared. They had expected to deal with one farmer and his wife, not a squad of police officers. Richard Davidson, Sheriff Morrison called, out as he approached. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Davidson's face went white. You can't prove anything. Actually, we can, Sheriff Morrison said. Thanks to the evidence Ms. Wells provided to the FBI 3 days ago. Jake looked at Catherine in surprise. She had been in contact with the authorities? When had that happened? Catherine saw his confused expression and spoke quietly so only he could hear. When those detectives came looking for Victoria Hartwell, I realized my time was running out. I called the real FBI and told them where I was hiding. I gave them copies of all the evidence I had been keeping safe. Jake felt a surge of admiration for his wife. Even when she was scared and hiding, she had found a way to do the right thing. Davidson's men were putting down their weapons and surrendering to the police. Davidson himself stood frozen, watching his entire criminal empire collapse around him. "It's over, Richard," Catherine said. "All your stolen money, all your fake accounts, everything. The FBI has it all now." As the police handcuffed Davidson and his men, Jake walked over to Catherine. She was shaking, but she was smiling through her tears. "Is it really over?" Jake asked. "It's really over," Catherine said. "I can stop running now. I can stop hiding." Jake looked at this brave, beautiful woman who had trusted him with her life. "So what happens now? Do you go back to your old life in the city?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, looking around at the ranch, the cattle, and the simple life they had built together. "I don't know," she said honestly. "What do you want to happen?" Jake thought about everything they had been through together. The strange beginning, the gradual trust, the partnership they had developed. Despite all the lies and deception, despite the danger and fear, he realized something important. He was in love with his wife. The police cars disappeared down the dusty road, taking Davidson and his men away in handcuffs. Jake and Catherine stood in the sudden quiet of the ranch, both of them still processing everything that had just happened. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the cattle were grazing peacefully as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Catherine turned to Jake, and for the first time since he had known her, there were no secrets between them. No veil hiding her face, no padding disguising her figure, no lies about who she was or why she was there. She looked vulnerable and beautiful and completely real. "I should pack my things," Catherine said quietly. "The FBI will probably want me to come to the city for more questioning and testimony. This whole legal process could take months." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're leaving?" "Our agreement was for marriage to help with my legal situation," Catherine said, not meeting his eyes. "That's done now. Davidson is arrested, the stolen money will be returned to his victims, and I don't need to hide anymore. You kept your end of the bargain, and so did I." Jake looked at her, this woman who had saved his ranch and turned his quiet life upside down. "Is that all this was to you? A business arrangement?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "That's what it was supposed to be. But is that what it became?" Catherine finally looked at him, and Jake could see tears starting to form in her eyes. "Jake, you don't understand. You married a woman who didn't exist. Victoria, the person you've been living with, was all pretend. You don't really know me at all, don't I?" Jake stepped closer to her. "I know you get up before dawn every morning because you like to watch the sunrise. I know you cook when you're worried because it helps you think. I know you're gentle with animals and you cry when you think no one can hear you." Catherine shook her head. "Those could be anyone's habits." "I know you're brave enough to risk everything to do what's right," Jake continued. "I know you're smart enough to outsmart criminals and kind enough to save a failing ranch belonging to a stranger. I know you make the best coffee I've ever tasted, and you know more about cattle than most people who've been ranching their whole lives. Jake, ... I know you lock your door every night because you've been afraid for so long that you can't remember how to feel safe," Jake said, his voice getting softer. "I know you're the strongest person I've ever met. And I know that everything good that's happened to me in the past month happened because you walked into my life." Catherine was crying now, but she was also smiling. "You really want me to stay? Even after all the lies, even knowing that I tricked you?" Jake reached out and gently touched her face, wiping away a tear with his thumb. "Catherine, you didn't trick me. You saved me. My ranch was about to be foreclosed. I was about to lose everything my family had built. You gave me a chance to keep going, but the cattle, the money for supplies, all of that came from the real Victoria Hartwell's estate," Catherine said. "I used a dead woman's resources to help you." "And what were you going to do with that money otherwise?" Jake asked. "Keep it for yourself?" Catherine shook her head. "No, I was planning to return it to her estate once this was all over. I only borrowed it because I was desperate." "So you risked your own safety to help a stranger, using money you were planning to give back anyway," Jake said. "How's that?" "Tricking me?" Catherine laughed through her tears. When you put it like that, it sounds almost noble. It was noble, Jake said firmly. Everything you did was about trying to make things right. You tried to expose Davidson's crimes. You tried to help his victims get their money back. You even tried to help me save my ranch. The only person you didn't try to help was yourself. They stood there in the fading light, looking at each other like they were seeing each other for the first time. In a way, all the pretense was gone now. All the secrets were out in the open. So what happens now? Catherine asked. If I stay, what would that look like? Jake thought about it. Well, legally we're married. But that was done under false pretenses, with a false identity. If you want, we could probably get it annulled pretty easily. Catherine's face fell slightly. Is that what you want? No, Jake said without hesitation. But I want you to have the choice. I want you to stay because you want to be here, not because you feel trapped or obligated. Catherine looked around the ranch, taking in the rolling fields, the grazing cattle, the simple house that had become her refuge. I've been running and hiding for so long, I forgot what it felt like to have a home. And now I think I remember, Catherine said softly. Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest, of course. Do you think you could love me? The real me, not the mysterious woman in the veil, but me as I actually am? Jake smiled. Catherine, I think I've been falling in love with the real you all along. The kindness, the intelligence, the strength, the way you care about doing the right thing even when it costs you everything, that was all real. That was all you. Catherine stepped closer to him. I think I've been falling in love with you too. With your gentleness and your loyalty and the way you kept me safe even when you didn't understand why I needed protecting. Jake reached for her hands. So what do you say we start over? No disguises, no secrets, no business arrangements. Just two people who want to build a life together. I'd like that, Catherine said. But I have to warn you, my real life is going to be complicated. For a while, there will be court cases and testimony. And probably reporters wanting to interview the woman who brought down Richard Davidson. We'll figure it out, Jake said. We've handled everything else that's come our way. As the first stars appeared, in the darkening sky, Jake and Catherine walked back toward the house together. The same house where they had lived as strangers, where Catherine had hidden behind locked doors and veils, where Jake had wondered every day what secrets his mysterious wife was keeping. You know, Catherine said as they reached the front porch, I'm going to have to learn how to be myself again. I've been pretending to be someone else for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to just be Catherine. I'll help you remember, Jake said. And you can help me figure out how to be a husband to someone who's actually choosing to be my wife. Catherine laughed. I think we're both going to be learning as we go. Inside the house, Catherine went to her room and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, left the door open. Jake could see her unpacking the real clothes she had been hiding, putting away the padding and disguises that had been her protection for so many months. Later that evening, they sat together on the front porch, drinking coffee and watching the cattle settle down for the night. No veils, no secrets, no fear. Just two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way and decided to build something real together. Jake, Catherine said as they sat in comfortable silence, yeah? Thank you for giving me a chance to find out who I really am. Jake smiled and took her hand. Thank you for saving my ranch and my life. I think we saved each other, Catherine said Dot as they sat together under the stars. Jake realized that sometimes the most important things came into your life when you least expected them. He had thought he was entering a business arrangement to save his family's land. Instead, he had found a partner, a love, and a future he never could have imagined. The drought was over. The cattle were thriving, and the woman beside him was no longer a mystery. She was simply Catherine, the brave accountant who had risked everything for justice and found love in the process. And that was more than enough for Jake.